This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At Military History Night of October the 26th, 2016, Derwin Mak presented his annual Halloween lecture on Greyfriars Kirkyard, Edinburgh's haunted cemetery.
A warm welcome, Derwin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat. All right. So, this location is Greyfriars Kirkyard, or churchyard, in Edinburgh. Right? And there is a shot of the famous churchyard, or kirkyard, as the Scots call it. Okay. Now, why is it called Greyfriars? Well, there's a church there called Greyfriars Kirk, or Greyfriars Church. And before the church was built, the previous occupants of that land were Franciscan monks. There was a monastery there. And the Franciscans wore gray robes, right? As in this painting of St. Francis. Now, during the Reformation, the monastery was dissolved and the Franciscans expelled off the property. But when other people built a church over the property, they remembered that the previous occupants had worn gray robes and they were monks, so hence the name Greyfriars. Okay. Now this is the church as it is today. That's Greyfriars Kirk. It was built in 1620 during the Reformation, right? So it belongs to the Church of Scotland, right? And it has an interesting history. For some reason, the city government of Edinburgh used to store its gunpowder in the church, right? So it's no surprise that in 1718, there was an explosion there. And then there was a fire in 1845. So the church has undergone various renovations and extensions and restorations. Now, surrounding the church is the cemetery, or the kirkyard, right? As you can see, it's rather bleak. All the monuments and stones have this black or gray color to them. It's not like a more recent cemetery like Mount Pleasant in Toronto where the stones come in different colors. Right? It was also notorious during the 18th century as the place where body snatchers would go and steal corpses to be sold to medical schools and anatomy students. But that industry or profession was by no means limited to Greyfriars. It happened all over the UK and could be the subject for an even longer lecture, but realize it happened there. Okay. There's more graves at Greyfriars. Okay. You can see they all have that gloomy black and gray look to them. Now, Greyfriars was built in the 1600s during the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Reformation, when it's usually taught in high schools, it's usually taught as being a revolt or protest against the Roman Catholic Church and the rise of a new form of Christianity, Protestantism. But that's a very simplified version of what happened during the Reformation. The Reformation was actually a lot more complicated. It actually gave rise to, rival versions of the Protestant religion, different Protestant sects. And after they got rid of the Roman Catholics, they started to fight against each other. Right? So, on the left, you see King Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Those three countries were separate countries, but they all shared the same king. Now, Charles I, though he was technically Scottish, because he was descended from the Stuart dynasty, actually preferred the Church of England. Right? He was very much an Anglican. He loved the church and its ritual, its pageantry, its hierarchy of bishops with power, and especially he liked the part where he got to be head of the Church of England because he was king. But king could resist all his power and authority, right? So he very much wished his subjects would just be like him and go along with the Church of England and the Anglican Church and Episcopalianism and all that it entailed. However, his Scottish subjects were developing their own version of Protestantism. They were developing Presbyterianism, very much influenced by John Knox, the fellow on the right, who in turn had been influenced by John Calvin in Switzerland. And they didn't really think that a king should be head of a church. After all, Jesus should be head of the church. And they didn't really share the king's infatuation with authority and hierarchy. So, but they coexisted for a little while. Now, it would take a whole separate lecture to go into the differences between the Church of England and the Church of Scotland during the Reformation. But the difference that I'll concentrate on, because it sparked the first newsworthy incident of violence between the two denominations, is the difference in the liturgies, right? How the service is to be conducted. Church of England, or the Anglicans, or Episcopalians, if you will, used the Book of Common Prayer. Right? However, in Scotland, the Scots preferred to use the Book of Common Order, also known as the John Knox liturgy. And these two liturgies still exist today. Now in 1637, King Charles I and the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, decided that they would try to impose religious conformity in all the king's subjects, right? Have them all worshiping the same way, which meant worshiping the way King Charles wanted them to worship. And they imposed the Book of Common Prayer on Scotland. Alas, the Scots do not take kindly to English people imposing their ways upon them, which they learned very quickly. So, on Sunday, July 13th, 1637, James Hanna, the Dean of Edinburgh, led a church service using the Book of Common Prayer. And Jenny Geddes, a common peasant woman, picked up her stool or chair and threw it at the Dean. Right? And this started the prayer book riot in Edinburgh, where people revolted against the use of the Book of Common Prayer. Okay, so violence had broken out, and by now the differences between the Anglicans and the Presbyterians were starting to get irreconcilable. So, and the Presbyterians felt they were beleaguered. So in 1538, in February, a group of Scottish nobility, gentry, clergy, and other notables of society gathered in Greyfriars Kirkyard, right in the cemetery, and signed the National Covenant. And this was an agreement by which they agreed to uphold their Presbyterian religion and oppose any foreign influences on religion in Scotland, all while still pledging allegiance to King Charles I. Now, this would be a very difficult covenant to uphold, considering the king opposed the covenant, right? And this is, here's a painting of it. You can see how romanticized this painting is. It's great and glorious, and you see Edinburgh Castle in the background, right? But this is a very important moment in Scottish history. It's part of their national identity, this national covenant. And those Presbyterians who either signed the National Covenant or pledged to uphold it became known as the Covenanters. If you go to Greyfriars, there's several monuments to the Covenanters. Here's one. It lists the names of the signers of the Covenant, as well as some famous persons who are buried at Greyfriars Kirkyard. Well, despite their pledge of loyalty to the king, their differences with the king became more and more difficult, and war eventually broke out between the king and the Covenanters. There were two of these wars between 1639 and 1640, the Bishops' Wars, with the English Anglicans and Scottish Royalists attacking the Scottish Presbyterians and Covenanters. The wars ended with victory for the Covenanters, and Charles was forced to sign a truce. However, this truce did not bring peace to the kingdom. Quite the contrary, it actually encouraged other people who disliked the king to rise up in rebellion. So, after the Covenanters had finished their war, the Irish rebelled against the king. Meanwhile, back home in London, the English Parliament was dominated by the king's political opponents, Oliver Cromwell, and yet another Protestant denomination, the Puritans. And the English Parliament rose up in rebellion against the king. So King Charles I spent the 1640s fighting rebellions, civil wars, and uprisings in all his three kingdoms. Now in 1643, the king was actually succeeding his wars in England. So the English Parliament asked the Scottish Parliament for help. They asked for an army to help defeat the king. The Scots, though, thought they could get something out of this alliance. So the Scots asked the English if they would sign the Solemn League and Covenant. And this was a treaty by which the Scots would send an army to England to help defeat the king. Now in return, the English were supposed to spread the Presbyterian religion into England. However, the English Parliament had its own Protestant denominations to take care of. Church of England and the Puritans especially. And they didn't really want to spread Scottish Presbyterian in England. So they worded the treaty so that it would say that the government and the church would be reformed according to the laws of God. Okay? Now, the Scots interpreted this to mean Presbyterianism. The English Parliament interpreted this to mean the status quo. Right? So this had to be one of the most poorly worded treaties in British history. But nonetheless, the two parliaments signed it with each side thinking they knew what it meant. And the Scots did join the English Civil War to fight the king. Well, as you know, the English Parliament did defeat the king. They captured him, put him in trial for treason, and executed him without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. This horrified the Scots. Although they had disagreed with the king on matters of religion and matters of government, and although they had rebelled against him and actually sent an army to defeat him, they never really intended to kill him. They didn't think of themselves as being regicides or traitors. So, and of course, he was also King of Scotland, and the English just hadn't consulted them on executing their king. Then the Scots discovered that the English were the most untrustworthy allies on earth. After having conquered England, Oliver Cromwell started looking at Scotland. And in 1650, he invaded Scotland and fought against his former allies, the Covenanters. And this is Cromwell at the Battle of Dunbar, one of his many victories over the Covenanters. Charles II, the son of Charles I, was now a prince without a kingdom, but he saw an opportunity to regain the monarchy in Scotland. So he went to Scotland and asked if he could be king there, and the Scots agreed on one condition, that he sign the National Covenant and uphold the Presbyterian religion. And this he agreed to, despite his father's great opposition to the National Covenant. Charles II said he'll uphold it, he'll spread the religion. And so the Scots crowned him king at Scone on January 1st, 1651. This is an English political cartoon showing the Scots holding Charles's nose to the grindstone. Of course, this was intended an insult to King Charles II because, it was an insult during those days to imply that a king would actually be controlled by his people instead of the other way around. And especially for a Stuart monarch, this was a grave insult. Alas, Charles' Scottish reign did not last very long. The English had kept on beating the Scots, and in 1651 at the Battle of Worcester, the royalists of the English Parliamentary Army defeated the Scottish Covenanters again. This battle ended with Charles II fleeing into exile into Europe, and the Scots losing their political independence. 3 years later, Oliver Cromwell and the English Parliament forced the three kingdoms to unite into one state, and Cromwell abolished the Scottish Parliament, but he did give 30 seats to Scotland at the Parliament at Westminster. Cromwell also reneged on the Solemn League and Covenant. He did not want to spread the Presbyterian religion throughout England and force people into it because he had his own Protestant denomination, the Puritans, to take care of. However, his regime did allow all Protestant denominations to coexist, and coexist they did, if rather uneasily at times. Despite their differences, though, they did all agree on one thing, and that was that Roman Catholics were heretics, traitors, and enemies. Well, after Cromwell died and his son was overthrown, the English Parliament, well, by then the British Parliament, asked Charles II to come back and be king. And this was the Restoration period, right? And Charles came back, and he repealed the acts that had been passed by Cromwell's parliament, so the Great Britain split back into 3 separate kingdoms again. But just like Cromwell, he reneged on the national covenant. He became like his father. He wanted to reimpose religious conformity on his kingdoms, and so, much to the disappointment of the Scots, he began to impose the Anglican form of religion on his subjects. I'm not sure why they were so surprised that the son would do what the father did, but he did. Of course, the Covenanters rebelled, and Charles retaliated, and this period is known as the Killing Times because of all the people who got killed in Scotland. Here's a painting of George Mackenzie, Lord Advocate of Scotland, the equivalent of an Attorney General. Now, he has an interesting reputation. If you read English history books, he's the Lord Advocate of Scotland for King Charles II, a man of education, learning, culture. He may have written the first modern novel in Scotland, and he built a library for the education of people. However, in Scotland, he has a rather different reputation. Read a history book written in Scotland. He's called Bloody Mackenzie because he was the person that the king put in charge of prosecuting or persecuting the Covenanters who refused to reject the national covenant and swear loyalty to King Charles II. Some historians say that he might have killed as many as 19,000 people during his purges. Well, during the fighting on June 22nd, 1639, the Royalist forces defeated the Covenanters at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, and Mackenzie took 1,200 prisoners. He took these prisoners to Greyfriars Kirkyard in June, and he imprisoned them there in a corner that would later be known as Covenanters' Prison. And he kept them there from June to November without shelter. They were exposed to the elements. They weren't put in houses or anything. And during those months, he and his men interrogated, tortured, starved, and executed them. By November, only 279 men had survived, and they were placed on a ship that would take them to exile in the American colonies. Unfortunately, that ship sank, and of that lot, only 48 survived. Right? So this is the grim history of Greyfriars. Not only is it the place where the Scots signed their national covenant, but it's also the place where about 1,200 of them got martyred for their religion. And this is a scene, this is a photograph of Covenanters' Prison as it is today. When Mackenzie died, he was interred in this mausoleum in Greyfriars Kirkyard, quite close to the bodies of the people he had killed, if not actually right over top of them, right? And this mausoleum has a nickname. It's called the Black Mausoleum due to the terrible reputation that Mackenzie had. But it's not all war and death and wars of religion at Greyfriars Kirkyard. Some people visit the kirkyard completely oblivious to the history of the religion there or of the civil wars that occurred there. They go there because they like animals, and Greyfriars Bobby is the most famous dog to have ever lived at Greyfriars Kirkyard. He's a Skye Terrier who visited his master's grave for 14 years in the 19th century. So on the left is a postcard, a Victorian postcard of Greyfriars Bobby, and on the right is his grave. The dog is actually buried in the cemetery. And there's the grave of his master, John Grey. Okay. So this loyal dog would visit this grave, for 14 years. And he became very famous. People came from all over Britain to visit the cemetery and see the dog. There were children's books written about him, and there's a Walt Disney book, a movie about him as well. So here's the poster from the Walt Disney movie. And a tourism industry sprung up around the dog, right? So inevitably, to serve all the tourists who were coming to Edinburgh, inns and restaurants and hotels sprang up. One of them is still there today. There's Greyfriars Bobby Inn. It's right outside the gate of the cemetery. Right? And here's a close-up shot of the sign above there. So the dog is still good for tourism. And tourists come from all over the world to see the statue. It sits atop a fountain. Now, no water has flowed out of the fountain since the 1970s due to health and sanitation concerns. Apparently the water was unclean and unsafe. But the fountain's still there, and so is the statue of the dog. You can see the nose of the dog is very shiny because people come and rub it for good luck. Okay? So this is a very cute story. You know, children love it. But was Greyfriars Bobby a hoax? Right? Now this is the interesting part. In modern times, some researchers have found out that he wasn't the only dog who visited the cemetery. In fact, it was actually quite normal for dogs to visit cemeteries back in the 19th century. And people would stroll through the cemetery every day, and when they saw stray dogs there, they would bring food and feed the dogs. Well, dogs are smart. They realize that if there's a place that people stroll through every day, and if they go to that place every day, people will feed them. So dogs would camp out at Greyfriars and other cemeteries and wait for food. So Greyfriars Bobby, far from being a loyal dog who visited his master's grave every day, may have just been a stray dog waiting for people to feed him. Okay? Now, there's a writer who claims that Greyfriars Bobby was a story invented by John Brown, the curator of the cemetery, and John Trail, a local restaurant owner. Now, why would they invent the story? Why would they select a dog and say, this dog comes to visit his master's grave every day? Well, it turns out that John Brown was hoping to increase donations to the church. And John Trail, being a local restaurant owner, wanted more tourists to come into the neighborhood. Right? There's also another researcher who has looked at photographs of Greyfriars Bobby that were taken over the years of his life, and has concluded that the original dog died and was secretly replaced by another dog as well. So, was Greyfriars Bobby real? Well, we know there actually was a dog there, but was it really a dog so loyal to his master that he came back to visit the grave every day? Or was it just a stray dog looking for food? We will probably never know. Well, all was quiet in the kirkyard between the death of Greyfriars Bobby until December 1998, not that long ago. Then in December 1998, a homeless man broke into the mausoleum and entered it. He was probably looking for shelter during the bad weather. Accounts of what happened in the mausoleum differ. Some people say he fell through a hole in the floor and wound up in a lower chamber where had been buried plague victims. Other people say he actually opened up the grave of George Mackenzie. But whatever happened, the night watchman saw the man run screaming out of the mausoleum. And the next evening, a woman tried to enter the mausoleum, but was forced back, pushed away by some invisible force. And then later in the week, another woman was found lying unconscious near the mausoleum, and she claimed something attacked her, some invisible thing. So, it didn't take long for people to blame the ghost of George Mackenzie for these attacks, and because this ghost seemed to be able to push people around, they called it the Mackenzie Poltergeist. Now, since 1998, 450 people have claimed they've been attacked by this ghost. Right? Of that lot, 180 of them lost consciousness, and they've claimed various injuries like broken fingers, their hair getting pulled, bruises, scratches, burns, nausea, numbness. Okay? Well, Edinburgh City Council thought there were too many people entering the cemetery at night to find this ghost. Right? So they ordered the cemetery locked up at night. But a tour operator and owner of a company, Blackheart Entertainment, Jan Andrew Henderson, told the city council that there was much tourism revenue to be made if he could operate controlled tours of the graveyard. Right? And he also offered an insurance indemnity so that anyone who got attacked by the ghost could not sue the city. Well, this offer was too good for the city council to refuse. So the city council did allow him to take people in the graveyard at night, and to this day he still operates a tour of the graveyard. He can't actually enter the mausoleum itself, but people do traipse around there at night. Okay. Now, Henderson likes to take photographs of people who encountered the ghost. He also takes witness testimonies and gets them to write letters to him. And he developed an archive of so-called evidence that there was a ghost or poltergeist there. And this is one of the photos that he had shot of someone who claimed to have been scratched by the Mackenzie Poltergeist. Now, in November 1999, a psychic named the Reverend Colin Grant attempted an exorcism at Greyfriars Kirkyard. However, his exorcism was unsuccessful. Partway through his chanting, he felt the presence of thousands of tortured and miserable and angry souls, and he left. Right? So he left prematurely, and then he died of a heart attack during a seance 6 weeks later. So, of course, the people blamed the ghost for killing him. Here's an interesting photograph from the Edinburgh Evening News. There's Colin Grant holding a candle while performing his exorcism. And take a look at the window on the extreme left. And in the upper right-hand corner is an enlargement of that part of the photograph. You can see a weird dark shape in the lower left-hand corner of the window. Susan Burrell, the photographer, says she doesn't know what that is. She says it wasn't caused by her camera flash. So no one has been able to figure out what that dark blob is. So of course, what do people think it is? They think it's the Mackenzie Poltergeist. Now in 2001, the tour operator Jan Andrew Henderson wrote a book about the poltergeist called The Ghost That Haunted Itself. Shortly afterwards, mysterious fires broke out at his house and at his office and destroyed much of his archives of photographs, letters, and testimonies. And of course, people blamed the ghost for these fires. Now, on June 30th, 2003, 2 teenage boys beheaded somebody's corpse in the Mackenzie Mausoleum. Now, this is a very curious story. There were a bunch of drunken teenagers. They had been drinking, and among them were a 15-year-old boy, a 17-year-old boy, and the 15-year-old girlfriend of the younger boy, right? And while they were drunk, one of their group said, "Let's go to the mausoleum and get George Mackenzie's head." So he broke into the cemetery and actually broke into the mausoleum. And there they opened up a grave, and one of the boys had a penknife, and they cut the head off one of the corpses and took it outside. And these teenagers tossed it around as if it were like a volleyball, and then they ran around with it, and they ran up and down a hill with it, and they accidentally dropped it on the street. Well, by now, certain passers-by had noticed that there were teenagers running around Edinburgh with a decapitated head, right? So, of course, the police arrived and arrested them. The 2 boys were charged with violating a sepulchre, and it was the first time in 100 years that anyone had been put in trial in Scotland for violating a sepulchre. That's an act that hadn't been used for years. It was originally passed to prosecute body snatchers who were stealing bodies for medical schools, right? So the 2 boys were convicted, but they did not do jail time. The younger one got 100 years of community service, and the older one got 100 hours of community service. Yeah. And the younger one got 200 hours of community service. Now here's the interesting part. This group of teenagers broke into the cemetery, entered the mausoleum, beheaded a corpse, and tossed around the head. None of them got attacked by the ghost, right? Also, this photograph is of questionable provenance. It comes from one of those tabloid magazines called True Crime, right? It's supposedly the head that was taken out of the Mackenzie Mausoleum, right? And True Crime says, oh yeah, this is for real. Of course, if it comes from True Crime magazine, you never know for sure, right? Also, the police never did say whose head had been taken out of the mausoleum. But True Crime interviewed the cemetery worker who had to take the head back into the mausoleum and reattach it to the corpse. And that worker claims that it was actually George Mackenzie himself. But if he was, his ghost seems to have been taking the day off. Okay, so here's my own visit to the mausoleum of Bloody Mackenzie, right? Okay, so there I am at it. Okay, you can probably tell I went there during daylight in the morning. Okay? No, it's not that I'm afraid to go there at night. It's just that I had tickets for the Royal Edinburgh military tattoo, and I figured that my last night in Edinburgh would probably be put to better use watching the tattoo than traipsing about a soggy graveyard at night. But anyway, nevertheless, I got there. So I was quite pleased to discover that the door had a hole large enough to put my hands and a camera through. So there it is, the inside of the mausoleum. Not terribly ornate, not much there. I tried to see if there were any coffins or caskets there, but they weren't. But maybe they're now placed behind that stone you see in front of you, which has very worn, the wording said, but it was very worn out. Okay, so I shot another photograph inside the mausoleum. And I saw those clamshells, carved at the top there. And that's a symbol of a Christian pilgrim to the Holy Land, right? I don't know if George Mackenzie ever got there, but he obviously must have liked the symbolism, right? And those shells appear again at the exterior of the mausoleum. Okay. Now, let's go next door to the kirkyard. Right outside, next door, is George Heriot's School. And it's a school named after George Heriot, a former royal goldsmith who had the money to build his own school. And there it is. It's still there. And one of the teachers there was J.K. Rowling, right? Who we know today as the author of the Harry Potter novels. But while she was a teacher at George Heriot's School, she used to visit Greyfriars Kirkyard during her lunch breaks. So, hence, another group of tourists show up at Greyfriars. These are the Harry Potter fans, right? And here's a photograph of a Harry Potter fan laying flowers at the grave of Tom Riddle. See, if you visit Greyfriars and look at the gravestones, the names there match the names of characters in the Harry Potter novels. Okay? So I went looking for them, and I found William McGonagall, a Scottish poet and playwright. Well, there's a McGonagall teaching at Hogwarts as well, and there she is. I found Mrs. Elizabeth Moody. Well, there's a Moody at Hogwarts as well, right? So lots of Harry Potter fans go there looking for graves of their famous characters. Well, not really of their famous characters, but of people with names of their favorite characters. And just like Greyfriars Bobby, J.K. Rowling has been good for tourism in the neighborhood as well. This is the Elephant House, a coffee shop near the cemetery. Okay, see lots of people piling in there. Now, look at the sign in the lower right-hand corner, just behind the bicycles. That coffee shop claims to be the birthplace of Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling would sit there and write parts of her novels in there during her breaks and her time off. She even made a promotional video for this coffee house. Now, I like this sign. It says birthplace in quotation marks of Harry Potter. And it also says the same thing in Chinese. When I was in Edinburgh, the place was overrun with tourists from mainland China. It's not like the old days when Chairman Mao kept them all at home and forbade them to leave. Now they're all over Europe. Okay? So, Greyfriars Kirkyard. It means many things to different people. Some people are Presbyterians or descendants of Scottish Covenanters, and they visit the place with a great sense of pride. because that's where the National Covenant was signed. That's where the Presbyterians agreed that they would promote the religion in their kingdom. But it's also a solemn place for them, because that's where bloody Mackenzie martyred 1,200 Covenanters. For people interested in the supernatural and ghosts, it's a place to go ghost hunting, because the Mackenzie Poltergeist is there. For people like animals or like cute dog stories, it's the place where Greyfriars Bobby lived. And for Harry Potter fans, it's a place of pilgrimage, because J.K. Rowling used to get character names from the stones. You may, when you go there, and I encourage you to go there, when you go there, you may have different motivations to go there. But I will give you one warning before you go there. No, I'm not going to talk about the poltergeist or the ghost. The thing that watch out the most for is the weather. When I was there, it rained on me 75% of the time. I was in Scotland. It's the most rainiest country ever been in. So come well dressed for the occasion. Okay, thanks, and that concludes our tour of Greyfriars. Questions, anybody?
Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, questions, anybody?
Was Mackenzie himself Scottish?
Mackenzie himself Scottish?
Is the name Scottish?
Yeah, I think he was Scottish, yes. Yeah, but obviously loyal to King Charles II, right? There are actually lots of Scots who were, like, it was practically a civil war situation with the Covenanters too, because though there were Covenanters, there were also Scots who were loyal to the king as well, and they fought each other.
How did Charles II make out as a king in the end?
Oh, I think he died a natural death, but his son James was the one who had to suffer through the glorious revolution of 1688. It was overthrown by William of Orange and Mary. But yeah, Charles II, well, it's interesting. A lot of people think of him as being the English version of Louis XIV. He had a reign that was very happy and merry, well, as long as you agreed with him, right? And it was a revival of English art and culture while he was there after the years of Puritan rule. But at the same time, in Scotland and Ireland, he has a rather bad reputation for persecuting Covenanters and Catholics. So it depends who you are, what your feelings on Charles II are.
Is the church still actively used, and is the graveyard now closed, or are there still burials going on there?
Okay, yeah, the church certainly is still actively used, still open for services, and you go to its website, you can actually see the schedule for services, and they hold other things there too, like lectures and concerts, so it's very much an active church, an active part of the community. I'm not sure though whether there's still buried people in there, because it's a really densely populated graveyard. In addition to people who have markers, there's also an unknown number of people who were buried there without a grave marker, like the 1,200 Covenanters who died there.
The saying is that the Scots are probably the best educated, or were in those days, of any of the people of the United Kingdom because of John Knox. John Knox encouraged the founding of schools because he wanted the Scots to read the Bible. That was how he was going to stimulate Presbyterianism in his case, or Calvinism really, and that's why they get that reputation of being so well educated, in that John Knox did far more that way than the rest of them who didn't want English to read anyway. They'd tell them what they needed to know. But John Knox wanted them to read the Bible, so he founded a lot of the schools there, and that's why some of them go back so far in Scotland in particular.
Yeah, he's definitely an important person in their history, and well, yeah, he's an okay guy. Yeah, I mean, he's definitely very instrumental in the development of the Presbyterian religion and the Scottish national identity, for sure.
Presbyterians were very much against music in the church. The Anglican church had the organ, so the Scots had a tuning fork. And one of my ancestors, when they decided to have a clarinet instead of a tuning fork, he left the church.
This has been another in the ongoing series of podcasts brought to you as an educational service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. You can keep abreast of our web offerings as well as our live events by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. Once again, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for being with us and good night.